since we are in a university, I do want to point out when I started this work that I was a student. I was a student at UCT, like what connects us, way back. And I think the real important thing that I remember right now is that this work exists because I was naive. I had no idea really what I was doing when I first started working on this project, and traveled all around South Africa for 6 years on the back of pickup trucks and any way I could to take these portraits. And like it's often said, naivete is protecting you. And for me that was true. And somehow that protection enabled me to do things that normally you can't do. So I'm telling my students, and thankfully some of them are here, even, try the impossible. Try something that you can't do. And that's sort of, you think is not possible, and it may happen. And that's really what led to Another Country, was 20 years later to realize what an amazing archive there is that I had from meeting 200 South Africans from all walks of life over those last, those few years before the transition. And it was my responsibility to go back and see what had happened to them. That's really the driving force, so that's the summary, really. And I remember, in 2009, like 6 years ago now, like, is this possible? Could I do this? Is that feasible? And we actually started talking about that quite early then, yeah? So maybe you should chime in there.
Well, I'm not sure what I could add to that other than perhaps talk a little bit about my juxtaposition, because I wasn't in the original book. Oh. And you put me next to one of my former professors, Annette Seegers, and I can remember, I was trying to remember back to the actual conversation we had, because it was in my office, and I think we took the photographs on a rainy day, because I think we tried taking some photographs outside, and it didn't work, so we ended up having an indoor photograph. And I was looking at the photograph, and it sort of almost looks like we had set it up to look like Annette Seegers, because on top of her head is the Statue of Liberty, so just above eye level. And then just above eye level on my photograph is a poster of Nelson Mandela, the HIV Wolanani poster. And I thought, oh, there's like a very interesting parallelism. But yeah, I think, I think being at UCT in the 1990s is probably also something that connects us. But we can talk about that throughout the conversation, because I think if we are going to be talking about the portraits, especially just before the elections, we have to talk a little bit about what that actually meant, what that moment actually meant, yeah.
Hlonipha suggested to start with Chris Honey's portrait. I don't know how many of you have seen the portrait and are familiar with it. I find this portrait is an extremely significant one for me personally. It was made not long after exiles were allowed to return to South Africa, and everyone who was helping and was trying to support my project said, he's never going to come, he's never going to meet you, no way, he's not going to come out. And I said, well, I made the appointment, I'm gonna try. And it's true, he didn't show up at first, and I waited, I think, 4 hours, 5 hours. I mean, it was a really long time. But then he showed up, and he was the most generous and giving person in that conversation. He talked about how his parents were illiterate, how his whole, he basically gave a 1 hour monologue that will actually be heard later this year at Goethe on Main in Johannesburg as part of an exhibition. And I still remember all those extremely sort of conflicting impulses and emotions when he was so soft spoken, and yet this very gentle demeanor and handshake, and I imagine what he how he was driven to so much connected to violence and desperation and very extreme way of being in the world, and I will never forget that. And then of course, not much longer after, he was assassinated and died. So it was this complete whirlwind of absorbing all these different things. So.
Yeah, I mean, the reason why I wanted to start with that particular portrait is in part because now Chris Hani, especially for members of my generation who didn't really know that much about, or I think don't really know that much about the history of the South African Communist Party, of the African National Congress, he has become a kind of romantic, saintly figure because, as you point out, he was assassinated, and he's not tainted by the complications of the present. And so for many younger people, I mean, I've heard people even say South Africa would be a better place because he would be president. I mean, all those kinds of counterfactuals, if one could put it that way, in which Chris Hani is now being slotted in as a kind of hero of everything that didn't happen in South Africa in the 1990s. And I think he's partly a representation of that disillusionment and the way in which people are searching for alternatives. But he's obviously not a viable alternative because he's not there. But at the same time, he's become a kind of iconic alternative for many people who are disenchanted with the present. And so there is that. And then there's also just the sense of what the 1990s were about. Because again, people tend to think of it and they remember the negotiations. It's as if the whole of the 1990s was just about these men in suits negotiating the transition, whereas in fact the 1990s were very violent in South Africa. And I think people tend to forget the violence because of what has happened after the violence. But it was, I mean, I can remember photographs of people who had been thrown off trains, severed limbs, and very few people remember that because the dominance of the image of the negotiations of Nelson Mandela of April 27, 1994 has made people forget that there was all this violence that actually pushed the negotiations. And the death of Chris Hani was also one of those things that actually pushed the negotiations rather than delayed them.
These are some images from the exhibition that was held of the project at the Johannesburg Art Gallery. And this triptych, or it doesn't, here it is. This was the piece you hosted here, which was so nice. Yeah. This is Gloria Marbella with her twin children. And Nete actually came to the opening in Johannesburg, and she is at that point a graduate of NUT, and was still looking for a job at the time after graduating for 2 years, so living with her aunt in Johannesburg. So she's one of the success stories and also pending outcome, what is going to happen. So that the twins were also, this image was on the cover of the old book, was also the question, what are the different possibilities where life can take these kids. Just get out of here. And then,
Do you want to say a little bit more about how you actually... Oh, right. So that's the Chris Hani picture.
Yeah, it was a remarkable situation because he literally spent 2 hours or more, with me, and he did everything I asked him to help me. He stood up, he draped the flag, I stepped on my film, he helped me. It was like this collaborative effort to build this image and to build the story. Of how he wanted it. The basic concept of the project was that the sitters would define their portrait by choosing the backdrop themselves and have an opportunity to direct the shoot. And if they took that opportunity, then that's what has happened.
And is that the same with the twins and their mother?
There was a language barrier, so we weren't able to talk that much. But what Nette was telling me about the car, which is in the picture, which I thought was fun, is that they were always fighting as children over who got to sit in the car, and her dad got this car to try and fix it up, which he never did, at least not in the last 20 years. And so they just played in it. So. So this is the image paired with Chris Harney, which was a complete fluke and coincidence. I came across the two walking along the street, and I stopped and said, "Well, can I take a picture?" And they were like, "Why?" And I was, we started talking, and it turned out that they lived in a municipality that was named after Chris Harney. So there was I didn't know who I was going to pair with Chris Harney, and there was. And I showed them the portrait of him, and that was the only reason they agreed to be photographed. And it seemed natural to. So throughout the book, so there is sort of a diversity of choices. On the one hand, it's prepared ahead for a long time, and then other things happen just out of serendipity or by chance.
And do you think that, I guess, what has happened to many of your younger, because now we're going to move to somebody who, many of the children that you photographed in the 1990s. I mean, what was the appeal to begin with? Because children are often very difficult to photograph, right? They don't have the same self-awareness that adults have. They don't want to curate themselves in the same way that adults would want to curate themselves. So what was the initial thinking behind just photographing children on their own, and then really trying to find the children again when you went back to South Africa?
I think the impulse to photograph children was to learn from everyone. I mean, for me, it was a learning experience. So I wanted to meet as many different positions, biographical positions, as possible. So that was around the country, but it also needed to be biographically different ages. Right. And that was the impulse. And going back, of course, this is an image of Christopher Jumat. And I want to give you something that you can't get from buying the book, right, or having the book. Reading the book is what happened here was actually, you don't see all the pictures that I took here, right? So initially this was a group of 3 kids that I photographed. And when I went back not just with a book that was published, but with my archive of all the pictures, looking for people. Since they lived on the street, it was maybe not so easy to find, but I did find one of the 3 children, and I found out what happened, to the others. And in fact, one of the other children was accused or was convicted of killing a foreigner, stabbing a foreigner to death in Cape Town Station, and at this point, he told me he had been released, but he wasn't coming out. He was so depressed and so down that he wasn't, you know, facing the world that much anymore. So I couldn't really meet him. But so there are many more stories and experiences in there that are not, you know, were not possible to picture in the book. And there's actually a woman lying under that blanket, and he volunteered that she had trouble with her boyfriend, and he had offered her protection and some kind of home, as he saw it on the street. And in fact, you can see things don't change. You know, when you look at his sneakers, see how important the shoes were then, and how important they are now. He had just been robbed and beaten by a security guard, but what he wanted most was new sneakers. So that was a priority. So I think there's a lot of things you find that don't change when you age, that seem to stay important and stay.
Right, because one of the things that we talked about when we were thinking about what kind of conversation we would have is this whole question of loss and what gets lost. The fact that Christopher loses his shoes and then really becomes almost at that moment the main primary loss. But obviously from your perspective as the photographer, the main loss is of the two people that were in the original image. And there are many of these stories of loss in another country in which people, the years have basically taken their toll, and what people talk about is what they've personally lost, even as they try to grapple with what the country has gained in a similar period of time.
Yeah, when I'm asked, you know, what has changed, you know, then the answer has to be it depends, right? It depends where you are, who you are, and what has changed for you. I mean, for Bernadine, when I went back to look for her in Stuyvesant, where this portrait was taken, nobody knew what had happened to her. I mean, that family left on the turn of a key within a very short time, and nobody could tell me where she was, and they all had a bad feeling that something had happened. And that was in fact true. She had left with her foster parents, who then adopted her because she was abused by her foster parents. So, and that's what she's talking about 20 years later. And so some of these things come out of healing as well. I mean, that you reflect and you find the time that has passed has helped to confront things successfully as well. It's one particular portrait I'm looking for. Right. Namaste Yeli. I just couldn't believe that I found her at all. That was, in a very fortuitous moment. I asked around the school where I had taken that picture 20 years before, and the 20th person said, "Yeah," showing the picture. I know. And of course she wasn't there. She was working somewhere else in Johannesburg. But as luck wanted it, she was on her way to come for vacation a few days later, and it was possible to meet her. And there she is 20 years later, in the same location after a lot of detours and sad stories. She's talking about, you know, being raped twice in one night by truck drivers and terrible things.
Well, I guess this is also the moment at which perhaps one could talk about your general sense of South Africa and why it would be important to even document where people are 20 years later. I mean, from a commonsensical perspective, you would know that everyone has moved on, right, after 20 years. But why in the case of South Africa, why is it important, do you think, to mark that 20 years?
I think it's extremely important just to remember your vulnerability to what is happening around you and to what happened in the past and how it affects what is happening in the future and what these forces are. I think that is the most critical thing for me, is to understand what are the forces that define our life. I think that's the most interesting form of discovery. I mean, that's why I'm at a university, and for me, it almost doesn't, art is one form of looking at it, but anthropology and other fields are other ways of looking at these forces. And a few days ago, I was talking to a mathematician, and it was like, wow, I wish I had studied math. I mean, like, why am I an artist? This is so much more interesting. But so in that sense, I think that's what it is for me. Is that fascination of what forces affect our lives and the opportunities we have to discover some of them. And that's I think what makes it important. Also important in terms of what decisions to be made in our society to influence those forces. So I think it's deeply political and it's deeply personal at the same time.
Right. But I think we also spoke about the power of forgetting, because one of the young women that you photographed was working in a tea factory. Completely forgot the person that she was in the image with. And when you went to speak to her 20 years later, she couldn't remember the man that you described as she had been so in love with.
Yeah. Right? I mean, you can see in the picture.
Right.
Non Pumilelo. Yeah.
Yeah. And so when you talk about the fact that when you then meet up with her, she couldn't even just remember the person's name that she was in the image with.
Yeah.
Right. And so there's also that power of sort of being able to erase something or someone from your memory, and put in whatever it is that is more comforting or more fitting for the moment that you're in. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there she is, 20 years later.
What was the other? We had a whole set of themes that we had worked around. We had, actually there is a whole thing about work as well, right?
Yeah.
Because one of the people that you do photograph is David Goldblatt.
Yes.
And he's very famous for having done a lot of workplace photography. So the one that I find quite moving is the Johannesburg Art Gallery. The two security guards,
yes,
representing almost two periods in the history of the Johannesburg Art Gallery. But David Goldblatt himself, as a working photographer, and how he himself has gone through a black and white and color photography phase. So you took him in the 1990s in black and white, and then you add the color photography in the same way that he has in his own practice moved away. So what does that feel like when you, I guess, photographing another photographer?
It feels good. I mean, David is an amazing person, and every time you meet him, it's a gift. But at the same time, he's also very critical. And I'm sort of worried what I would hear if you would have the book right now in front of you. He was quite helpful when I first worked on the first book. He helped me edit, and he was very generous. And he started a photography workshop in South Africa. He's an amazing figure. in that context. And yes, labor is absolutely, and work is an absolute red line or string that refers to the book, and artists in general.
Right. I think the other artist is William Kentridge.
William Kentridge,
right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's also very interesting. Where you see William Kentridge as a kind of younger artist, and all I think the naive.
Jürgen Schauderberg.
Mm-hmm.
There it is.
Right. So do you want to talk a little bit about that conversation?
Yeah, I remember William's first major success when I was a student, and he had entered a competition. I had also entered, and he won. And I remember him sitting on a chair, and when the winner was announced, how he jumped up into the air like a gymnast or something. It was really emotional, and it was so nice. He won with one of his films, one of his early films. It was right in the mid '90s, and early '90s even, early '90s, and he was sitting in his house then. The new portrait is actually taken in a studio that is built in his garden, and at that time, I mean, what he was talking about he expected when his family left for England that he would basically be diminishing the estate, and to survive as an artist in the country, he would have to sell off pieces of land until there would be nothing left. In fact, the opposite fortunately for him, has happened. He's done extremely well, and was able to build a studio. That's where the studio was, inside the house. Now his studio is outside the house in addition to the property. So what his expectations were and what actually happened is completely contrary. Yeah. And another thing that comes to mind when I think about William Kentridge is his father, because I met them in Munich when they were both on a panel with each other, talking about William's work, and his father being a judge and an attorney, being the guest, and I was just amazed. That was part of the exhibition Rise and Fall of Apartheid that Okwi and Weser had curated, and that had traveled extensively and was in Munich at the Haus der Kunst. And there they were both sitting, talking about their lives. And in fact, a memorable thing that William was talking about was that the importance of photography in his life. When he was a kid, he opened a box on his father's desk that looked like a candy box. And he was hoping to get some candy, but in fact that box contained photographs of evidence that he never forgot, and sort of, shaped his life in a way. That's how he was talking about. So embedded in that drawing, in that filmmaking, is also an experience of how photographs have shaped his history of the country.
I think also perhaps there is this, what was in the 1990s an anxiety about what South African art would look like after apartheid. So I think there's also, in a sense, when you read many of the narratives, people were not sure about what their careers would look like, because there was no longer this enemy called apartheid that they could write against or paint against or photograph against. And so envisioning what a new country, what artistic endeavors would sort of work in that new country, what stories needed to be told about that new country. must have been quite difficult for many artists, including many of the actors that you have. So you have the Market Theatre. I mean, that also went through a whole sort of an identity crisis with the end of apartheid. And many of the actors who went to the Market Theatre are now soap opera stars in South Africa. And so there has been this kind of almost reinvigoration of South African art post-apartheid, which nobody expected, I think, in the 1990s. There was a deep-seated, almost not even anxiety, but almost deflation, as if the end of apartheid had sort of taken the energy out of artistic production.
Yeah. Well, here's Barney Simon.
Yeah.
With Siputla Sebogodi on the right. And Barney has passed away, of course. And here's Siputla on the set, or near the set of in SABC Studios, and he was a big soap opera star at the time. And he is seeing it. He's seeing it a little more negatively, though, than you do. He writes about, if Barney was still alive, he would scold me and he would say I'm a sellout. I'm doing soapies now, and he was the real thing in terms of inspiring us to make true art that is about life and larger questions of humanity. And from what I can tell, is like, theater needs public support, and which Germany is very good at, and that seems to be lacking for many who work in theater. They seem, they feel the recognition, the critical recognition, when they respected by a South African president and acknowledged, but the actual support to do their work is not always there.
Yeah, well, I guess one could say the same thing about most South African artists, including photographers. As you know, we've had several controversies about photography and how the state often has or the Minister of Culture, we should be specific, the Minister of Culture often has a very different idea about what South African photographers should be photographing. And then when she appears at these events where the government has actually sponsored the event, then she's like, oh, but this is not what I expected. So since we've had some of those controversies, do you want to say anything about how that fits into this perception of what is art, I guess, post-apartheid, or what is the art of a new society? How should a new society conceive its artistic production?
Well, that's a complex question that would probably take us quite far, but what it triggers for me is just a quick memory and reference that Paul Weinberger, photographer at UCP, he was one, because you were talking about the elections and what does that mean in '94, what that meant. And he was one of 4 photographers the government had hired to document the elections, the historic elections. And only a few years ago, he was telling me that the photographs are gone, that nobody had. He was trying to see where they are, and in the archive in Pretoria, they were nowhere to be found. And in fact, a lot of documentation from those years has disappeared. That's not exactly about art making, but it is about the relationship between governments and how they take care of, he was also, of course, promoting his own institution, because UCT has built an archive, a center for the archive, and is trying to raise money for it to protect and to archive artifacts like photographs and things like that. But to come back to your actual, to your real question, I think a lot of South African artists have moved on and have address questions that go beyond that election and that apartheid protest art layer. I mean, Damon Galbraith is one of the writers who was like, I feel like it's claustrophobic for me that I feel like I have to write about this. I'm writing about something else. I'm an artist. I want to do something. And many South African artists have successfully done so. I think it is liberating, but I think it should also be possible. In the same way that it needs to remain possible to make art about everything. I mean, at least since Duchamp, I think there shouldn't be any limitation of what it could be.
Well, and I mean, talking about, I guess, the possibilities, maybe you could say a little bit about the title of and the change from the blue portraits to another country. Do you think that it is another country? What were you? Because I'm gonna say I can't remember the song, but there's a song I think that has got the line "another country," and then the second line after that is "another state of grace." But I have no idea who sings the song, and it's in my head, so I don't want to say too much about it, just in case it's like Britney Spears or something sings the song. So a part of me thinks, were you thinking of something like that, the kind of, I guess, poetic lyricism of just thinking of it as another country, even though the people are the same, if one could put it that way?
Well, for me, it was a way of connecting it to America, of course, to James Baldwin and to his characters. So it was a way of connecting it to fiction in a way, but fiction that is maybe more able to tell the truth. And I was trying to hint at the relationship between fiction and nonfiction. In a way, I was also, of course, talking about the South African reference to another country with the character, being in 19th century South Africa, the colonial history. So, another country is, for me, is an ambiguous thing. It's also, when something changes, there's elements that stay the same and vice versa. So, it's like, what is happening in America is, of course, something also that I'm trying to understand. I've only lived here for 20 years, so for me, I'm still trying to understand how is it possible, what has happened, all our injustice and the horrors of those, that were embedded in those last few hundred years here, and how are we always doing this to each other? What makes us tick? What are these forces? So, so there's always, it's the same, but it's different. It's a paradox.
Do you think we should open up for the audience and allow?
Let me get the mic here, because if you would please speak into the mic, since we're taking this. I'll be happy to start. Take the mic back.
Now, you just talked about the fact that you've lived here for a long time. Obviously, you've lived in South Africa, while obviously you grew up in Germany. And I'm just curious how your gaze has changed due to being in other countries. Like, or has it changed? How has it changed? Or do you wish it had changed and then find it hasn't?
Has it changed? It's my view of Germany, or my...
No, your view on the world. I'm just like curious. You know, many of us who are here, we grew up in different cultures. Grew up in different languages. We find ourselves here, and in between we were maybe in even other cultures. And I'm just like wondering how that, how that experience changes your view of the world and your gaze onto others, and perhaps it doesn't. I'm just like opening that.
Yeah, that's the question about the others is maybe is the central question, because South Africa is so often discussed as exceptionalism, right? It's only South Africa managed to overcome this thing. It's really this very special nation, and I fail to see the big differences. I find that but it's semantics. But I think what makes us tick as people is fundamentally so similar that I find it very hard to. I mean, obviously there are differences. I mean, why are the fastest running people all coming out of a small marathon and long distance, all coming out of a small geographical area somewhere, right? So obviously geography and ethnicity and all these things play a role. They're part of the forces. But essentially, I think there are very few things that make us tick as human beings. And it's, in an odd way, they are very simple. It's kind of scary how simple it is. But it is a paradox because the way these forces come together is very complicated. So I guess that's how I have to answer the question. I feel like what we do, living in South Africa made me understand Germany better.
In what way?
In a way that perception is a matter of distance, right? If you're too close, you don't see anything. I'm over here, I can't see anything. If I'm over there, I can't see anything either. So it's about having an appropriate distance, and that's what helped me. And I think that's what is so amazing about the DAD and all those institutions and the Fulbright and the Gates and all those foundations who make it possible for people to go to other places. Is you change your distance, and it makes it easier to see. Because you can change your position, and by how you viewed. Of course, when you're in Germany and you're German, you don't exist as German because you're among Germans. But if you go through to South Africa or New Guinea or to Colombia, you're the German, right? Suddenly you're that's isolating, and it has plus and minuses, but it moves you into a position of being looked at as something else than where you come from, because of where you come from. So all of this happens because you're changing the context.
How do you feel about that question from your own experience of changing places?
I think for me it's always difficult because I've also been outside of South Africa at very important moments. So, for example, I was in boarding school in England during the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and so I'm often shocked when I read about the TRC and I just realize that it's almost like a hole in my brain, that I wasn't there. I mean, I read about it in the paper, but it's not the same as being there. And even now, having lived here for 8 years, it's very difficult to see South Africa and not be reminded of that feeling that you're missing out on something, that somehow it's a combination of both patriotism and then almost also a sense of loss in some ways, that as the time goes by, you lose some of that feeling of what it feels like to be South African. But at the same time, it also allows you, as Reiner was talking about it, to realize how very similar many things are. How from a distance the United States may look so perfect, for example, when it comes to issues like race. I think when I came here, I was quite shocked by how live race still is as an issue in America. It's one of these things when you're in South Africa and people talk about race in South Africa, you think, oh wow, we're the worst. And then you come to America and you're like, I think you have problems too. So that sense that these kinds of things from a distance look like other countries have solved their problems. So for example, with the whole, in the last 2-3 weeks in South Africa, there have been all these xenophobic attacks, and from my perspective here, obviously I feel the shame, I feel the embarrassment, I feel the anger, but then at the same time, it almost happened exactly at the same time as the sinking of the boats in the Mediterranean, and then you suddenly realize, well, actually we're all dealing with the problem of migrants and how citizens react to migrants, and all the kinds of issues that are involved. And so I think living outside of South Africa makes you realize that our problems are just problems in some ways, that they have solutions, but that it's not a mark on us as South Africans, that we're not somehow managing to solve these problems, that other people are struggling with the same. But I think also there is a sense in which South Africans have also a very conflicted cosmopolitanism, because within South Africa there's so much diversity that we often struggle looking out. So we can be quite an insular society as well, in which we are always talking about our problems and not really realizing how much we share those predicaments with other people.
Other questions?
I have a very simple question, Reiner. What was it that made you go to the University of Cape Town?
See, we were very simple.
Can you speak into the mic?
I'm sorry. I wanted to get as far away as possible from Germany, right? So that was the principal idea. And I got in 3 months between the end of my community service and the beginning of my studies. And when I walked into, I wanted to see all the art schools, right? I wanted to study art, and they were just all setting up, and they were installing their partitions and getting ready, and there was a woman who I thought, wow, we should go for tea, and that was it. Yeah. So I had to go back. I mean, not that she would even, still, consider having tea with me. But anyway, I was. That was, to be totally honest, that was one of the reasons. But the more serious and deeper answer is that in those 3 months, I felt that this was, living there would be the best education I could get. Because exactly for the reason I was mentioning before in terms of perception, everything was so out in the open. For me in Germany, it was much harder to see what was really going on. I was too familiar with it. Here it was something that was unfamiliar, so it was easier for me to read, easier to see, and easier to learn. And I could learn all these contradictions that are at work in a society. All these, what still, boggles my mind at right now is, at that, it was, the late 80s and early 90s, it was changing, and the beginning was happening, and yet, it was still the depth of apartheid. But at the same time, that horrible system also brought out some of the best in people who were working against it. So, that was just amazing to see the opposition, that vitality that came out that I'd never experienced in Germany. Anyway, there was that urge of doing something that mattered, was just dramatic, and UCT was certainly part of that. Part of that opportunity to be, to observe that, or to be aware of that and to learn from that.
Well, I think I understand correctly that you went to South Africa, that you took portraits of people, and then you went back after an interval of 20 years or something, and you were looking for the same people. So meeting these people and taking portraits of them, do you think it allowed you to understand the development not only of the individual people, but the development of the country, what has been going on? Does it allow to generalize, or is it just really you see the people and their very individual history?
I would not generalize. No, I think that is the point of the project. Is how history plays out in an individual life, and that's very very complex and contradictory, and yeah, and it's, I've only met maybe 200 people in that intense way. That's a very small sample, but you know, there's some terrifying things happening. This is one example of a couple with their children who I found later. Again, here they are. And when I went back to the same place where they were, it was a heartbreaking story when the neighbors were telling me that they had, you know, the mother had killed the father in an attack in alcoholic rage, and then the mother had died of an illness that people always don't want to mention what it is, but. And here they are, she was, you know, she wanted this picture so badly that I had of her mother. She said, "I don't have a picture of my mother. This is the only picture I have of my mother." And you know, and then there are stories that are exactly the opposite of children. That's the Magana family, where, you know, one is an accountant, the other one an attorney, and they're, you know, talking about going to, you know, they've been to the US for training, they want to go to graduate school here, they have great careers, they have cars, what is even more is they talk about how they want to do things for them. They say that they're only ones in their neighborhood who have a college degree, university degree, and they're going to go from school to school and motivate these kids to make it happen for them. They're not just in it for themselves. They actually already got to the next step and say, here we are, we know what worked for us, and we're going to help others to make that same step. And this is next, you know, this is, one story is like that next to the other stories. It's like, where are you? I mean, you know, Lizzie has 5 kids, and it's interesting that there are 3 in this picture and 2 here, because the older kids did not get that benefit. They were just a little late to get that wave of the curve. In the same family, in the same house. How do you generalize? I don't know. It's pain and exclusion is very individual, and joy is too.
So my question is almost similar to this one. I wanted to ask, from the 200 people you took pictures of, was it all over South Africa?
Yeah.
And if the economic prospects of the people, does it reflect sort of a rural-urban divide, to say people that you took pictures of, say in rural KwaZulu-Natal, now are still in the same, you know, conditions of poverty, and those you took pictures of in sort of urban areas have better prospects presently? Of course, accepting the big guys like Dudu and the rest, because they're successful right now, but for the general common people you take pictures of. Thank you.
Yes, the chances are that in an urban area you have more access to resources, water, electricity, than in a rural area. But that's changing too. I'm not a statistician, but it's anecdotally that may be true.
Do you want to say a little bit about the photograph that is absent from here, that we had a long conversation about? One of the, because it's taken in a rural area of the children, and in a way how haunted the photograph is, because it represents so many things that are difficult about growing up in a rural area in South Africa.
Yes, it's a photograph of two small children near a graveyard. The graveyard is not visible, but it's sort of implied, right? You almost picked up on it in a way just by looking at this picture. And it turns out that it's a girl and a boy, and the girl is a friend of Nette, the baby you saw breastfeeding on Glory Maibella's chest. And the two of them are standing there confidently, just looking at the camera, wondering what is going on. And when I went back, I was, of course, looking for them, and the Maibella family was telling me that the girl was still alive, that she was around. I had her cell phone number, but she didn't answer. People run out of money, and they don't always pick up, and the boy had died quite early. Also HIV and AIDS.
I was just going to ask you something about this work, and applies to some of your other work, which is done 20 years previously, before the advent of the iPhone, and now. The role, so much about the work is showing people the photograph and getting them then, of course, to reflect on the differences. Could you do this again 20 years from now? Or is the abundance of digital photography, I'm watching my son here flick through and select 300 of his favorite photos while you're talking, from the last 3 days. Would it have the same power as a memory jog, as a trigger? You talk about some of the people for whom it's the only photograph. Others are obviously more affluent people who have access to plenty of photographs, but obviously the photograph plays such a powerful role with the text, and I'm wondering, is this something you would be able to do again 20 years from now?
Well, I'm probably going to be too old to do it, but
just as naive.
Yeah, let me be as naive as I was then, and I think yes. I think the quality of it would be, because it's connected to what is existing already now. If it has any power, I mean, it's interesting to see how we dependent we are on the media landscape, right? When Blue Portraits came out in '93, it was just on the eve before the election. It was on prime television news. It was in all the national newspapers in Germany. And when the book came out in Germany, now it was not interesting for the German media landscape. It was just, it's other topics and other ideas are important now. South Africa has a hard time to make that threshold of being of interest in that media landscape. So it's a relative thing, and I think I knew that before I started. I was very aware of that changed interest in it, and I feel like we have to do things that are not always immediately visible as beneficial, or as immediately, will be carried by the mainstream media. I think you have to do things while they're important and while you can do them, so they gain the weight that they will have for, like Boyce was saying, planting oak trees. It's not to your benefit. It's whoever is going to harvest them. It's not going to be you. You're not going to benefit from it. But hopefully there's some value for future generations.
This is great, Reiner, and especially going back some years. I don't know.
Right, you helped
yeah.
create it. Yeah.
Well, not really, but we all talked about this around that seminar table. So, but just hearing you saying you were interested in individuals being shaped by the forces of history, but them as individuals. Of course, it sounds like novels to me, or stories. And I just realized that we're seeing the pictures, but we're also seeing the text. Could you read a little of the text so we get a feeling of, that's a whole major part of your book. And if you wouldn't mind picking out an excerpt that would just shorter.
I think you have to read it. I think it is, that's, you know, I was hoping that I don't take someone else's voice. You know, that is, you know, what I think what I understood with photographs is that they, you know, when you learn photography, they teach you in a course. They teach you about composition and how to hold a camera and what makes a good photograph, right? But it's that's somewhat a lie, too, because you know what makes a photograph is what you think about. And if you think of Anne Frank's portrait, you know, when it was in the photo album of the family, it was just a picture of a teenager. And now when you look at this picture, all this unfolds that you know what is connected to that photograph. It's a huge universe of knowledge and impressions, and ultimately it's text chain, right? That's the text we were talking about. So my way of trying to get around that or to expand on that was saying, okay, I'm not writing about anyone. I'm going to hopefully give people an opportunity to negotiate that relationship between text and their photograph themselves. I mean, I'd still fail because I make mistakes and the transcription is not right, and I even got the name wrong, and I mean, it's terrible. You know, I mean, you can't escape. You know, you still make mistakes, but it's based on the realization that the context of the photograph determines how you experience it. And so, forgive me, I'd rather not read. I think I want them, your mind to go in conversation when you read it, or if people read it. You should read your own text. That would be
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll go with that.
You could read your text. There you
do
go.
that a little.
Right.
That
I
would
think
be
I've got
great.
a copy of the book.
I have the book right here.
Right. Well, I can just read a little excerpt. Thank you.
Sure.
So 222, right? Just to satisfy your. I think it's 222.
There it is.
Okay. So. Yes. No. I was. Actually. Where can I? Okay. So I'll just start in the middle about what has changed in South Africa. It's often difficult to talk about what has changed in South Africa because you yourself are implicated in that change. You have benefited or been negatively affected by the change. More and more, the problems of the country are no longer purely about race. The more you look around, you see that class is beginning to determine how people live their lives. Whether you are rich or poor in South Africa means much more than whether you are black or white. It is often difficult for people to accept that a country that was so deeply racist could actually move away so quickly from race. When I'm in South Africa, nobody cares that I'm black. They look at the way you dress, the way you talk, then make decisions about who you are, because those markers say a lot about you, about class. When you are black, you can get away with a lot, because of the way that you talk and the way that you express yourself. I would say that South Africa is in some sense a post-racial society. Not because race is dead, but because race is becoming less and less meaningful in explaining the things that are happening in the country. There are so many things that have happened that have nothing to do with race. But post-racial is a complicated term because even in the US, people aren't sure what it means to say with the election of Obama, the United States is post-racial. Many young South Africans now would not see limitations. There's just such a burst of possibilities, career-wise, intellectually, culturally. People who are 5 or 10 years younger than me can dream and do things we would never have imagined doing when we were growing up. So that gives you a sense of
Thank you.
what
That was wonderful. Yes.
I just have a question. Upon your return, even before you showed photos or prints, did most people remember you? How firm were their memories, and how did they differ amongst the different groups, country, city, class that you saw? And were some of these, as you said, some of the photos became very important to people, but was the event memorable to themselves?
Yes, quite often, quite often. But also, like the children, no. The younger, no. But many, yeah. And some people were not, Bulelani Kuka, he was not famous. He became very famous later. And, yeah, so.
Another photography question?
If you talk it to the mic.
Yes. What kind of camera did you use? Not necessarily exactly, but how different was your shooting then and then when you went back?
The cameras are very slow cameras, to speak about it in terms that are not for technically interested people. But I'm using a medium format camera that is on a tripod in the first project that is very cumbersome, where you have to take the film on and off, and it takes really long time. It slows everything down. It's cheap because it was a used camera, of course, and I had no money, and it made the conversation more important in relationship to what was happening. But it was so complicated that for the new project I did have a more contemporary camera, but it was also a film camera. But a little faster, a little safer to make sure it's in focus and things like that. So.
If there are no more questions, I'd like to thank you all for coming, and I'd like to thank Reiner and Hlonipha for sharing their thoughts with us and making this, I believe, a very memorable evening for all of us. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.